Spring. Spring is in the air, huh? May it happen also in terms of the political front. I tell you, it's like it's really something, isn't it?
We've got quite a winter of discontent.
Yes, right. Who would that? Is that Faulkner? Who wrote Winter of Discontent? I don't remember, but it's true. Yeah, welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Bob Fertig, and he's with the force behind, I think, he could share with us others that might be involved, behind a really interesting website and movement, as it were, in the country called Democrats.com, and he's a political activist, and Bob, welcome very much to Conversations and Manhattan Network.
Pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, it is. And this coming into the spring out of our winter of discontent and a certain thing, that people see things in a certain way. We're going to want to talk about the political climate. You're obviously a Democrat aficionado and so forth, and we're going to want to talk about the state of things political. But I wonder, maybe you could, Bob, if you would share a little bit of your own background, and then we can go into a talk about things political and about the website you have, which is really an interesting one. But share your own background, please.
Well, I'm a product of New York City. I grew up in Queens, went through New York City public schools, moved to Westchester, graduated from Irvington High School in Westchester, went to Brown for a couple of years, went to Yale for a couple of years, and got a degree in economic and social theory and history. And then I went into politics.
Mm-hmm.
And also at the same time as I got involved in the political world, I also got involved in the computer world. And so those two things have been the parallel rails that have guided my life. And so I've done a number of things over the years, including working in various progressive movements. I've been involved in the pro-choice movement, and very extensively I've been involved in, I wrote a book on abortion politics.
Mm-hmm.
I've been involved in starting a number of feminist and pro-choice organizations, and I've also been involved in consulting for political candidates, and that all came together with the creation of Democrats.com in 2000, and we are now the largest community for Democratic activists around the country. We have about 100,000 people who are involved in our community.
Really? 100,000 people are involved around that site?
Yes, that are on our email list, and it's very easy. You just go to Democrats.com and you can subscribe. We publish a newsletter that goes out. There's a daily version of it for the people who really want to know everything that's going on, and we also have a weekly version for people who only want so much.
Mm-hmm.
And we have an online community where people can gather and chat and participate, and we do online polls, and we're also involved in working with all of our progressive allies, including organizing demonstrations and getting people engaged in all the issues that we all care about. It's not just about politics. The point for being involved in politics is to bring about change.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're involved with environmental groups and with feminist groups and with African American groups and all kinds of groups that are working for justice, for peace. We've been very involved in the peace movement.
Mm-hmm.
That's why people become Democrats, and that's what we're trying to facilitate.
Mm-hmm. Now, good for you. Well, you got your work cut out for you. It's a big canvas to work on if you're looking at injustice and peace, particularly in this season, because things are really moving in a very rapid way in this country that is, to many people, very disquieting in terms of beginning, let's say, perhaps, even roots going back further, but the election of 2000 was just something else, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's really where we got started. We started at the convention, and we were very excited about Al Gore. Not only did he invent the Internet, but
yes.
he was terrific on all the issues that we care about.
Mm-hmm.
And
Earth and the Balance is a good book.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And he's remained committed to those issues. And we thought he was a great candidate, and so the American people, because he won by more than 500,000 votes.
Indeed.
Nationally. Then we got into the Florida recount and discovered what was going on there, because according to the exit polls, Al Gore had won Florida, and as we were all watching on election night, the first calls that came in for Gore. And that was accurate, because when people voted, the majority of Floridians intended to cast their vote for Al Gore.
That's right. That's right. And the early what do they call them? Exit polls, or however they judge that thing. What is that company that does that? There's a thing that the networks all depend upon, a service.
It's called Voter News Service.
That's it. Yeah, and they had made projections. Those projections should have held if there hadn't been so many butterfly ballot mix-ups and that sort of thing that skewed it. But they're system of projecting, probably as it had in the past, would have held true, and Gore would have won Florida and the election, no?
That's right.
If there hadn't been the irregularity.
There were, at the end of the day, there were 175,000 ballots that didn't go through the machines for one reason or another. Overvotes, undervotes. And thanks to the Supreme Court, thanks to a Republican majority on the Supreme Court, led by Rehnquist, the Chief Justice, and Scalia, they decided, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Bush versus Gore, they ruled that it would be bad for the country, it would be bad for George Bush if all the votes were counted. Yeah. So they decided not to count 175,000 votes. And they came up with all kinds of obscure and arcane and lawless reasons for doing it, based on the 14th Amendment, that Chads had to be counted the same in 2 different counties. Just there's no law professor in the country that looks at this. I mean, this is really creating a crisis in the law schools, because if you try to teach the case of Bush versus Gore, there's no law behind it. It violates every principle that the Supreme Court has affirmed, including the principle that a Supreme Court case should set a precedent. The Supreme Court said this is a one-time only ruling. Don't ever apply it to any other case. That just violates the whole concept of the Supreme Court as creating law. So we, as a community, we were very involved in the whole recount, trying to make sure that every vote was counted. We were involved in organizing street protests all around the country because people wanted every vote to be counted. We were all watching it on TV. We all knew that what was going on was wrong. And Al Gore should have won. When a year later, they finally did a recount. The media companies all got together. They formed something ominously called the consortium, which is very appropriate. And they counted every vote. And when they went through with it, when they decided that if all the votes had been counted, Al Gore won. The only in Florida. Because
go ahead.
The only scenario under which Al Gore didn't win were the scenarios where they didn't count all the votes, where they said, okay, we'll count the Palm Beach votes, but we won't count the Miami votes, things like that. But if they counted every vote, Al Gore won, depending on how many corners a Chad had to have detached, one corner, 2 corners, didn't matter. Al Gore won under each of those scenarios between a couple of hundred votes and 1,000 votes. George Bush was certified the winner by 537, but that didn't include that involved throwing out the votes from Palm Beach that were actually counted. But then Catherine Harris said you had to get them in by
Tuesday at 2 or something.
At a certain time, even though the Supreme Court, the Florida court, had said she could give an extension. So it was a debacle. It was a coup d'état. We don't live. Democracy died on December 12th, 2000, which was the day on which the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, chose George Bush as the president. It was not an election, it was a selection. And we've been suffering the consequences ever since.
Yeah, we've been suffering. It'll be revisited historically and so forth. It'll be revisited and will be a day of infamy in a certain sense. You use the term coup d'etat. That generally is a term, but I feel the same way, that we've been taken over by, and then they're marching as though they had a mandate.
They have no mandate. They lost the popular vote, so they never could claim a mandate. The majority of Americans, or the majority of those casting a vote, never embraced the right-wing policies that Bush has implemented. And in fact, he didn't even run on these right-wing policies. He ran on a humble foreign policy. There's been no humility that any of us
he
have
said,
seen.
I don't cotton to nation building and that kind of thing. And he hadn't traveled much out of the country, even as before he was a candidate.
Right.
You know, it was amazing. It was a thing that gave a lot of pause, not only here in the country but around the world. I think it's taking an example of that, and then it continues. And then they go with this very extreme group. I wonder. We have this group. We have Richard Pearl, we have Wolfowitz, and we have Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld. So they're a group that are loosely called the neocons. Can you spell out for us about who they are, where they came from, and do they effectively have the ear of this president? Is he one of them, root and branch? And who are these neocons that seem to have taken over the Republican Party, taken over the country, and thereby the world? A small group of, relatively small group of ideologues called the neocons. Could you focus on them for a while? Who they are, where they come from, what their roots are?
Well, they're, as you say, they're ideologues, first of all. They're people who didn't serve in the military, for example. I mean, they're all chicken hawks. They're all people who, when it was their turn to serve found an excuse not to serve, and that would include George Bush, whose father got him into the Air National Guard at a time when it was impossible to get into the National Guard, and he never went to Vietnam, and in fact he never even fulfilled his 6-year obligation in the National Guard. He was AWOL for the last 2 years of his term, which nobody in America knows.
Well, they do now. Yeah.
Your listeners do.
Yes, yeah.
But I'm sure they already figured that one out.
Yeah. Or they could go to Democrats.com and find
Yes, they sure can.
Yeah, okay.
So he would fit into the category of people who were, although he did actually serve for at least 4 years, he was trained as a pilot. But most of these people, Wolfowitz, Pearl, have never served. Cheney, coming up with one excuse or another for not putting their lives on the line, but they're very eager to put everybody else's lives on the line, especially if they're poor, especially if they're black or Hispanic or don't have the connections to keep themselves out of the military. So these people are, they start out as liberals, some of them. They're called neocons because they switched. They became conservatives. They weren't the old conservatives like Pat Buchanan or William Buckley, whose presence you don't see really much in this administration. They come out of industry. They come out of lobbying. They formed a group. Many of them served in the first Bush administration, and when that administration ended, they formed a group called PNAC, which is the Project for a New American Century.
Yes.
And they wrote a number of papers laying out their vision of America's role in the world. And to an extent, where they start from is the fact that at the end of the Cold War, which ended when George Bush I was in power, the United States has power that's unmatched. Nobody can challenge us. So,
unmatched in the history of the planet.
In the history of the world. So what's to be done with that? And there's a law of politics that power abhors a vacuum, and there was a vacuum. And these folks wanted to fill it. They wanted the U.S. to go beyond its traditional defensive posture and its NATO alliance, which was intended to keep us safe and protect us. And they wanted to go into a more offensive mode. They wanted to project American power around the world.
Right. Yeah.
And they have this vision of expanding bases into Central Asia and into the Middle East. And
everywhere around the world.
Everywhere around the world. And so they laid this out. And it involved not just military power, but also economic power. It involved control over strategic resources like oil, like water, which are going to be key to life in the 21st century, and that was their vision. And when they came into power, it's not clear whether that agenda was really George Bush's agenda. Certainly he appointed the members of PNAC, like Donald Rumsfeld, like Dick Cheney, to key positions, Wolfowitz, Pearl. But it's not clear that he was going down that road until September 11th, and that allegedly changed Bush's perspective. But of course, we don't know any of this. And George Bush himself is so carefully protected and kept from us, the people who didn't even vote for him, that we never get a chance to ask him to really probe what's in his mind. So we get these little, interviews like, I guess Tom Brokaw did one this week. But he doesn't take press conference questions. He looks very uncomfortable when he's asked a question that he hasn't been prepared for. And it's just a travesty of democracy. But now they're in firm control. There's no question that Colin Powell, who is perceived as the dove in this administration, which is kind of funny because Colin Powell, of course, is a military man. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And his whole career has been devoted to the military. He was involved in the My Lai cover-up.
He was, really?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he was?
As a young lieutenant, that's kind of how he got his start up the ranks. He's always been involved in these kind of shady military questions. And he's the dove. So there are no doves in this administration. It's completely an oil-dominated administration. And we see that in Iraq now with the awarding of the contracts to Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company, to Bechtel, which is the company that Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz and previous administrations came out of. And, they're in firm control. They are sitting around saying, where do we go next? We're not, as a people, as an American people, we're not involved in that decision in any way.
Yeah, I wonder, you talk about that neoconservative, because you talk to, Schultz and Caspar Weinberger and so forth, or even one might say George Herbert Walker Bush, whether or not you got Brent Scowcroft, you got some of the conservatives, or Bill Buckley. You have a conservative movement that's been there for some time. You had Barry Goldwater. And then we had Ronald Reagan. 1980. I remember 1982 we had a huge thing. We was going to put cruise missiles, and that was peace through strength. They were going to bring American values to the world by peace through strength. That's sort of, in a certain sense, a militaristic or expansion of American power and that sort of thing. But is there a division, do you think, between the conservatives, the traditional conservatives, Barry Goldwater conservatives, or something of that sort, much less even maybe President Bush 1, and what's happening now, and the neo-conservatives? There's a break between those two, or do they stand together? Or what do you think?
There are differences of philosophy between the more traditional conservatives, and some of them are pretty conservative. I mean, there are differences over issues involving the projection of American power. Pat Buchanan, for example, wrote a whole piece attacking the neocons in his magazine, which is called The American Conservative. And he wrote a very in-depth piece basically saying that it wasn't about American interest. It wasn't in America's interest to do all the things that these folks are doing. That it was really other people's interests that we were involved, Israel, and catering to their interests even more so than our interests.
Buchanan brought that up.
That was Pat Buchanan.
Was at that Israel, because that's a big issue now, because the Middle East, some people say that, was Sharon or the Likudniks, or much less the other fellow, what's his name, the one that was the UN, whether or not they were part and parcel of the neocon coalition back in the 70s. Did they get going in the 1970s? They were sort of a voice in the wilderness, but then when Mr. Reagan came into power, they really soared. But was Sharon and the Likud party in Israel part of that neocon coalition?
Well, it actually worked the other way, where a lot of the people who are the powerful and prominent neocons were involved in the Sharon and Netanyahu governments.
Yeah, right.
They were actually involved in Likud, and that includes people like Wolfowitz and Pearl, who were actually advisors to the Israeli government.
So there's a link there.
Oh, there's definitely a link.
I mean, that's part of a tripod of the neocon thing, would be Sharon's government in Israel.
Right. And Richard Pearl...
peace through strength again, yeah?
Right. Richard Pearl's roots go back. He worked for Scoop Jackson, a very conservative Democrat from Washington State. He was caught spying for Israel when he was working in the Congress. So that goes back a very long way. There are very close ties, and... to the rest of the world, there's a conspiracy. I mean, there's no question in the rest of the world that the neocon establishment is a fundamentally Jewish, conservative, Likud alliance.
You think the world sees that?
Absolutely.
Huh? They do see that.
Absolutely.
Well, that's interesting, because we don't see that much
don't
here.
See that. Right.
And then we have another leg, if I could, of that neocon, if I could, whether or not, because I saw a piece that Bob Simon did with 60 Minutes about the fundamentalist Christians. Here, you got 50 million fundamentalist Christians. That would be Falwell, Robertson, and the people who follow them, who see the whole world through the eyes of Revelations, John Revelation, that we're coming to the end of time and so forth, and that they give tremendous political support to that neocon coalition. Can you address that, or is that correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
I mean, that's like Falwell and so forth. He called Muhammad a terrorist. And,
yes.
And so they get the Islam as, we used to have communism, now we got the Islam, or could you address that?
Well, there's been a resurgence in the United States of the religious right, and it goes back, I mean, it's part and parcel of America. There's nothing really new about it. But the political organizing and the political right in the most notably around Jerry Falwell, around Pat Robertson, but also Franklin Graham, who's the son of Billy Graham.
That's right. He's been saying some outlandish things.
Right, and he's very close to George Bush. In fact, he's the one that's credited with Bush's born-again discovery when he was 40, when he gave up drinking and decided to become a Christian.
Yeah.
That was with during a walk with Franklin Graham, and Franklin Graham remains very close to them. What we have actually is this quite a stunning alliance between these conservative Jews and conservative Christians. And as you say, it involves a theological approach from the Christian side. It involves a theology of the end
of time, yeah.
and the rapture, which involves the notion that there will be a war, Armageddon will occur in the Middle East, and that will herald in the second coming of Christ, and those who have embraced Christ will be risen into heaven, and those who have not embraced Christ will have to suffer the consequences. And that's a viewpoint that's reflected in the author, whose name escapes me, who's written all these books. Very
Lindsay?
popular.
No, somebody. No, I can't recall either.
Is it Jim Baker or somebody who was a fundamentalist preacher? And there's a large constituency. Now, it's not as powerful a political constituency as it really was in the Reagan era. The Christian coalition is not the force that it used to be.
Okay.
And Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell were seriously discredited on September 11th when they blamed the attack, right there that evening.
On gays.
On gays and lesbians and liberals and feminists, and they said that God had intended for 9/11.
The liberals, on the liberals, I'm sorry, go ahead.
We were, that it was our fault that God was punishing us, which was just outrageous.
Yeah, I know,
But it was perfectly in keeping with everything else they've ever said.
Yeah, but that does give a lot of political support to this group and so forth, and it just creates a kind of context that's a little hard to understand for a lot of people, and it's come out of the blue. But the distinction between the traditional conservative and the neocon who have now taken over, I don't know, maybe it's going too far and so forth, but I do remember that Adolf Hitler was voted in Nazi Germany, and that there had been, things going on there. And one wonders whether, and he was with support and so forth. I don't know, is that analogy going too far in terms of whether we're down the line toward what would be similar to an emerging fascist reality in this country that, if it's not checked, could gallop because we begin to look at the erosion of civil liberties and so forth now, that we really could be on a course that would be carrying us down a really disastrous path toward out-and-out fascistic control of this country and world?
Well, we don't like...
Or is that too far?
Personally, I don't like to sound alarmist, but I think everything that you said is exactly true, including the parallels...
Unfortunately.
Yeah. The role of propaganda is such an important part of the Nazi rise to power, and it's so much a part of Bush's rise to power and the neocon rise to power. We have a media in this country that's completely controlled by a few people, and it's completely subservient to the interests of the very powerful. And it no longer serves as a forum for informing us and for educating us and for providing us with all the information we need to know.
Did you see that the head of the BBC just excoriated the American coverage of the war as being just outlandishly, slavishly propagandistic and so forth? And it's really true. It became so obvious.
It's completely
true. It's like
true.
a wholly owned subsidiary of the White House, the networks or something. It seemed that way. Even the cable networks that you thought were supposed to give a little more variety. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
they went to the extent all three of the cable news networks, which are now so important, and so many of us tune in to get our
CNN and NBC,
to catch what's going on at any given moment in the day, and there is no dissent tolerated on those. Phil Donahue had a show.
Gone.
And they canceled it just before.
Put on Scarborough.
Just
instead.
before, and they put on it. Yeah, and they put Joe Scarborough, who's a congressman, a right-wing congressman out of Florida.
Savage is coming on now, is he?
Michael Savage, who's got an atrocious record, and these are the people that they're putting on. There's just no liberal voices. I mean, Eric Alterman's written a terrific book.
Yeah, Eric, I saw him the other day. Yeah.
I mean, there's not even a pretense of balance. I mean, for a moment when they had Phil Donahue on, there was a pretense. Now there's none. And so we get nothing but propaganda.
How did they get away with that? We used to have a liberal Democrat. Democrats were associated with what was called liberals, a rich liberal tradition. It brought a great deal of good things to this country, and a lot of things like Social Security is very popular, Medicare, a lot of things that were done in the name of a liberal view of things, largely through the Democratic Party. What was it that made it possible for the word liberal? Do you remember? You probably lived through it. The word liberal came to be almost as a dirty word somehow in the press and in the general vernacular of the country. How in the hell did that happen and why? Mario Cuomo and so forth, they would say he's a liberal, and that became to be almost like, remember they used to have back in the old days, the commies and so forth? But how did that happen? Why?
It happened.
Why?
Well, it happened during Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
It happened with people like Pat Buchanan and William Safire, who were writing speeches for Richard Nixon and for Spiro Agnew.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened during the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a very divisive event.
Horrible.
You know, just horrible, and created this polarization in the country that's really not gone away.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it kind of mixed the lines, because the Democrats, who had been united around FDR and around Truman and around Kennedy, suddenly were deeply divided, with a lot of working class white Democrats being pulled into Nixon's view of the world, which was, you know, that the war was good and justified. Their sons were fighting it.
Yeah.
And, you know, meanwhile, the more affluent Democrats whose kids were in college, they were protesting. It created a, you know, deep division.
Remember the Democratic Convention in 1968 in Chicago? And Mr. Humphrey came within a hair's breadth of beating Nixon, but that was a dividing line, right? I mean, that war in Vietnam really was dividing.
Yeah, and that was also, you know, another example of a stolen election, where they had an October surprise where Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey were working towards a negotiation with the North Vietnamese to end the war. And Nixon's people, led by Helen Chennault, convinced the North Vietnamese that they would do better not to agree to the terms of that peace treaty, and that prevented the peace treaty in '68 that would have allowed Hubert Humphrey to win. Nixon ran, remember, as a peace candidate, but he didn't get there until 1972 and '74,
after bombing in Cambodia in 1970 and all that.
Right.
It was just awful, you know.
Right.
So that whole thing was awful, and it did. And so, but we had this tradition, liberal, conservative, and so forth. And that's still with us, right? I mean, that division. And what is it we're talking about when we talk about the liberal impetus in the human society, let's say, something of that sort? Seems to me identified with a great deal of the appropriate utilization of government policy in order sort of to help the masses of the people. Am I wrong on that? The conservative side seems to be favored toward the well-to-do, the well-established, and that sort of thing. That dynamic is still with us on a world global scale, is it not?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, liberals created programs, all the New Deal programs, you know,
They're being
environmental
eroded.
protection.
They're trying to be eroded
Social
now.
Security,
Yeah.
Medicare. Every one of these programs was fought tooth and nail by the Republicans, by the conservatives, as they were being created. And they've tried to roll them back at every opportunity. Ronald Reagan did everything he could to roll back these programs. And Bush is going way beyond what Ronald Reagan even tried to do.
He's the son of, they had a piece that they had in the Times where he was the son of Reagan more than the son of George Herbert Walker Bush in some way. I mean, it was a continuation of the Reagan view of things, and things really got rolling in 1980, in terms of this conservative trend.
Yeah, well, that came out of the '64 campaign of Barry Goldwater. That's where the new right kind of crystallized. And then, and that was a libertarian sort of conservatism, but it was very much, you know, taking on the liberal establishment and coming out of the South and establishing the Republican Party as a Southern party. The Republican Party, of course, had been the party of Abraham Lincoln, was the party of the North. For the Civil War, was the party of the North. And it was after '64 and then '68 with the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon that the Republican Party shifted to the South and embraced the conservatives. And the reason that happened was because of the Civil Rights Movement, because the Democrats, led by John F. Kennedy, who shook hands with Martin Luther King in 1960, a very dramatic event that alienated white voters,
in the South.
Black voters shifted over to the Democratic Party as a result of that, and when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1964, he said, this is the end for Democrats in the South. We just lost the South. And that was completely true, because white Southerners were horrified that blacks were given equal rights. And and when Barry Goldwater and then Richard Nixon reached out to them and said, join us in the Republican Party. Remember, the white Southerners hated Republicans because they'd been the carpetbaggers in the party of the Union. When Richard Nixon reached out to them and they switched over, and people like Trent Lott, who had been Democrats, switched over to become Republicans, embracing the Southern white racists. And that has been the basis of Republican power has been the solid South
Yeah.
since 1968.
The South will rise again.
Now,
That includes Texas.
that includes Texas.
Yeah.
Now, first Jimmy Carter, coming out of Georgia in 1980, was able to win a couple of southern states. And then Bill Clinton in 1992, coming out of Arkansas,
Yeah.
which is on the border, was able to win some southern states.
Yeah.
And that's been where the Democrats have found that their best chances of victory is to nominate somebody from the South, because to win this electoral college map that we have.
Yeah.
So that brings us into this election, and what it's going to take to beat Bush when he has a lot of power, a lot of popularity in the South, enough to win those states.
Yeah, the South, and that's why a lot of people look at Dean, that sort of thing. But that idea, the Voting Rights Act, that was a force that was not to be denied at all. I remember all of that was going, and then Martin King's speech and that sort of thing. It was a thing. And also, they got a long way along, Mr. Johnson got a long way along on what was the war on poverty, Head Start, a lot of things that were giving a democratic impetus to let's get everybody involved in this situation rather than just the plutocratic few and that sort of thing. Got a long way, and it might very well have been able to get established in a better kind of way than it was able, except for that war.
That's
that
right.
war took all of the assets and took all of the resources and made it impossible. So you had a clash between the social impetus to improve the society that was very much in the air at that time, and this awful war. So we have the same kind of impetus here in the society now.
Yeah, you can definitely trace it through. I mean, just the economic cost of the Vietnam War, not to mention the political cost, which we talked about earlier, the division that created. But the economic cost led to a period following the war of inflation and stagnation, and that was the problem that Jimmy Carter was confronted with as president, and forced him to really scale back the expectations for what a liberal government could do. And his big focus was to just rein in inflation.
Yeah.
And then the Republicans came along with Reagan in 1980 and took a totally radical approach to the problem of government. The problem with
government was get it off your back.
How to shut it down. And
right.
because there was so much support for these programs that were, the liberal agenda for health care, for education, for the environmental protection, there was so much support for that you could never win a vote in Congress if the issue was an up or down vote. Should we have Medicare or not? Of course the vote for Medicare would win. So what they had to do was come up with a strategy where they had to destroy these programs by creating these massive deficits, so that you would have to
starve it to death.
You'd have to starve it. You'd have to look at the programs and set them in competition with each other, so that you couldn't have all of them. And you had to shrink the government, and you had to create battles between the different groups.
Yeah, Mr. Reagan said the government's a problem. Get it off our back. That would be get it off the back of the big corporations and so forth. And then it was a divide and conquer kind of strategy like the British used in the colonial empire.
Exactly.
In a certain sense could be seen that way. And it seems to have worked.
It works.
To a
It works. We
considerable
see
degree.
it every day.
And there's a massive
Right.
assault that's been going on for a couple decades now upon the whole legacy, let's say, Roosevelt legacy. Would that be right? Franklin
Yes.
Roosevelt legacy, the New Deal, that sort of thing. It's an assault that's gathering steam now, and now has now landed us in this pretty fix that we're in now. Do you think we said the South will rise again? The Southern politics is rising. The liberal impetus will rise again?
Well, the South is a difficult area for a liberal.
I think I was thinking on a world scale, maybe.
Well,
The
what's going on-
liberal impetus in the human society that is there, is there.
Yeah.
That seems to be so under attack and seems to be so, almost some people see even the Democratic Party as having almost been supine. They voted the power to Mr. Reagan, to Mr. Bush. They voted in there, and they've been more or less supine in terms of his war effort and so forth. In the minds of many people, they have not been able to be offering an alternative to the militaristic kind of fear-mongering and so forth that Mr. Bush is putting forth in the minds of many people.
Well, that's why Democrats.com exists. We are the members of the Democratic Party that believe the party should stand up for its principles.
All right. And what are those principles?
Well, the principles are justice, equality, freedom, democracy,
Won't
opportunity.
Won't all political parties say they stand for that?
Well, they don't.
You think they don't, but they don't. Okay, but you understand what I'm saying. Everyone will stand for justice. Everyone will stand for opportunity.
They don't.
Okay.
You can't have justice if you have a 5-4 vote of the Supreme Court that decides that 175,000 votes shouldn't be counted. That's not justice. That's not democracy. So any party that allows that to happen cannot claim to support justice. affirmative action is part of justice, and the Republicans want to eviscerate the laws that support affirmative action.
But they're not going to run on a platform and say we're running for injustice.
No, they don't.
They
exactly.
don't say that. What are the principles they're
Exactly.
running on? That's what I'm saying. These conservative impetus in the human scenario now. What is their notion of what justice is? I mean, they have this idea of supply side economics. They're going to give a huge tax cut. The big cornerstone of Mr. Bush's economic plan, even before the 9/11 and so forth, was that we're going to give a huge tax cut to the large part of which go already to the already wealthy. There's a certain kind of philosophy in terms of how you create a just society. It's associated with trickling down of resources to the folks and so forth. But what is the basis of their view of economic justice, let's say? What are they advancing?
Well, their view of economic justice is if you're rich, you should be powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're poor, you should be weak. You should have no rights. Mm-hmm. That's their view.
You do feel
it's pure Darwinism. It is economic Darwinism.
It's Hobbesian kind of thing,
yeah.
huh?
And they disguise it because they're the rich guys. They're the ones that are making all the money. I mean, Dick Cheney and Halliburton. That's where the money goes. So they can't come out and say, we are the party of corruption, we're the party of greed, we're the party of crony capitalism, we're the party of monopoly power. They can't say that because they have to go out and go through these elections, even if they're not real elections. They're close enough to a real election.
And the government is the problem. You're going to get government off the back. You're going to get government off the back, and so you're going to cut taxes upon people in order to get government out of the picture.
Well,
and as you say, starve government with these social programs. You're going to give money to the poor or something, they have Medicare. You starve those programs to death by running up huge deficits. How much deficit was it that Mr. Reagan had run up? Or was it something in the trillions or something?
He came in, there was a $1 trillion debt, a national debt. It accumulated over all the presidents leading up to Reagan. When he left, it was at $4 trillion.
Yeah, $4 trillion. That's right. He left at that, and yet they were supposedly be the fiscal conservatives who believed in non-deficit kind of notions of economics and so forth. And yet they ran it up by supporting a huge buildup of the military, voting down, tax cuts and that thing. They built up this kind of thing and voted the military. Isn't it still in place now? That basic pattern that Mr. Reagan favored.
I mean,
it's a continuation of that.
In 1980, when there was a primary between Reagan and George Bush the Senior, George Bush Senior called Reagan's economics voodoo economics because he said there's no way you can massively increase the military budget, massively cut taxes, primarily for the wealthy, and balance the budget, which were the three stands of his chair.
So we built up through $4 trillion
So
in deficit.
he said you couldn't do it, and he was exactly right. It was voodoo economics then, and it created these massive deficits. And then we went through a period where the deficits were the national problem, and we had to get them under control. And that's where Ross Perot came out in 1992.
That's right.
And
the Concord Coalition.
And his whole appeal to the public was first in 1988, then again in 92, was to eliminate the deficits. And Bill Clinton
followed through on that.
Actually, he did follow through with it. It took him 8 years, but when he left office, we'd gone from $300 or $400 billion annual deficits to a surplus, $200 billion surplus. We were looking at projected a 10-year projected surplus of $5.4 trillion.
That high, 5.4. Yeah.
That's when Bush came into office, the beginning of 2000.
And in the greatest period of economic expansion in the history of the country.
And a period in which incomes at all levels rose, because we just got the statistics in last week that since Bush took over, incomes for everybody at all economic levels are going down. But it was during the Clinton years that incomes for everybody went up, not to mention the stock market and the wealth that created. If you're I always think it's kind of funny because if you are a Republican, if you're a wealthy person, you ought to support the Democrats because when the Democrats are in power, the economy booms and people get wealthy.
I think there are a lot of people who did. I think there are a lot of people who do that because they can see the interest rates are going to be appropriate to a long-term growth and so forth, so the stock market can go up and all that. I think there are a number of people of the plutocratic class that support very well the democratic notion of things, and yet there we are. And we had this thing, and now we're projecting deficits, and the deficits are beginning to build as far as you can see. And you can see, particularly as far as any social program that might come legislatively or through the governmental process that would aid, let's say, the masses of the people and so forth, are going to be starved to death.
Right.
And they're going to, so this is what's going on now.
It's going to affect every one of us in our lives. It's going to affect, people who are retired going on to Social Security. Social Security is not going to be there when these folks get through with it, when they get through privatizing it into a stock market that's at best flatlining, and there's no there's no rate of return for investing in the stock market now. If your Social Security were dependent on that, you would be looking at an ever shrinking retirement fund. Healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid. All these funds are shrinking. The quality of service, the availability of healthcare services is deteriorating. Our hospitals are shutting down. Our teachers are getting laid off. Our schools are closing.
Every municipality and state in the country are in deep deficit and doo-doo now. Look at what poor Mr. Pataki and Bloomberg are having to deal with right here in New York City.
Yeah, these are massive numbers. I mean, these are unprecedented numbers, and there was so much prosperity when Bush came in 2000. The question before the country was, how are we going to
possibly spend all this surplus?
What are we going to do with all the surplus? And was it bad for the economy to be running the surplus? And they were so eager to cut taxes for the wealthy that, and now 2 years later, look, and yet, this is part of the problem with the media, is that there's absolutely no perspective, no reflection, no going back and saying, well, you said we had all this money. Where did it all go? I mean, how could we as a nation go from a projected surplus of $5 trillion to a projected deficit of $2 trillion, and nobody's saying, where did the money go?
Yeah, right.
Where did that money go? That was our money. George Bush ran on it's our money. Well, it's our money that's vanished. We're in the red. We are passing these deficits on to our children and our grandchildren, these massive deficits. And it's going to affect everything in our lives. And, and there ought to be a mass movement to throw these people out of power because they have so mismanaged the economy, and so their ideology is so disastrous. And we need to create that in the coming year.
Disastrous from your perspective, the way you see things, not disastrous from the way they see things. And they seem to have what's the term, the bit in their mouth now. They've taken the bit in the teeth and so forth, and they're running. And they're going, and since 9/11, and since the danger posed by terrorism, which is an unending kind of thing when you start thinking about it, if you're dealing with the world, they have a militaristic kind of solution to everything, and they're expanding everywhere with their military power. And they will run, as much as the Democrats have tried to, I said before, there's been very little opposition to the war. There was great trauma after 9/11. Mr. Bush played that very, very well. I mean, played upon the fears that are there, and the existential fears perhaps even. And he's going to continue to play on that because the economic arguments are not that good that he can make. He hasn't got much to make and so forth. But he's going to play. Is the election going to be able to be on economic issues that affect real folks in this country and so forth, as the Democrats would prefer, I think? Or is it going to be able to confront frontally the militaristic attitude that Mr. Bush is assuming toward the rest of the world with this war on terrorism that threatens to go into every one of the continents and so forth? And will that be by fear? Will he be able to lead the nation into another 4-year term? And what are going to be the big issues they're going to be able to play from a political perspective of trying to get somebody else in the White House from your view?
You're exactly right. I mean, to the extent that the Republicans can control it, and they can because they control the media, and they control the issues that are on our television screens every day, day after day after day.
Yeah, relentless.
And they can create a war anytime they want to.
That's right.
They can say that there are weapons of mass destruction in Syria, and they could start a war in Syria or Libya, or they can go anywhere in the world. They can spin the globe, and they can put their finger down anywhere they want and say, oh, there's a reason to go to war there. They might possibly threaten us. That's the Bush doctrine, is that any country that might possibly. Yes. Now, this is where democracy has a role to play. We, the American people, have to stand up and say, we are not going to allow this to go on. We do not want perpetual war. We do not want to go around the world and just invade countries willy-nilly. 130 Americans died in the war in Iraq. And what did they die for? Every day, the story changes. First, it was the weapons of mass destruction.
Can't seem to find them.
Well, there aren't any, and they won't allow the UN to come back in because they want to plant the evidence so they can concoct it after
You
the
ask
fact.
anybody around town where they do a drug bust and the police will be there long enough, you're going to find some crack there.
That's right.
That's going to be planted, right?
That's
they
right.
could do the same thing there. The people would see that.
And that's exactly what the world expects, is that they're going to go plant some evidence somewhere. The fact that they have not found it now.
You don't want Mr. Blix back in because that might be impartial. Right?
Exactly. That's exactly what's going on.
You do think that, yeah?
Absolutely. So there's the that was one reason, and then there was the reason about
regime change for some reason.
Yeah. Well, we went in there. Yes, Saddam was a bad guy, but we all knew that. I mean, he's been a bad guy since the CIA helped bring him to power.
So was Noriega, for that matter. But anyway, yeah.
There are a lot of bad guys around the world, and I don't see us. There are 1.2 billion Chinese people who live under a dictatorship.
That's a big question.
I don't see, Bush invading China to free the Chinese, the 1.2 billion Chinese.
You can't do that because they have atomic weapons, or they have an arsenal big enough to be able to combat us.
They're not doing
or even
it
little North Korea can
because
do that.
they don't have oil.
No, they don't. Okay.
They chose Iraq because Iraq has 10% of the world's oil. It's not because Saddam was a dictator, because they're, a dictatorial regime, because Saudi Arabia is a dictatorial regime, too.
You don't think there's any tie into the Iraq thing because of Sharon Netanyahu and Israel? That Israel is going to be part of that thing, and they wanted to destabilize the whole era. By taking Iraq, they're going to be able to destabilize any threat. They will now go into Hezbollah, Hamas, and other kinds of things that are supporting the Palestinians. You don't
Absolutely.
Think, you think that has something to do with it?
There was a convergence of reasons.
Because you said there were these three parts to this neocon thing, one of which is the Likud in Israel, which they, just as the right wing has the bit in their teeth here, they have it in Israel as well. You might as well forget about labor and Ben-Gurion and Peace Now and so forth. Those things have been part of the kibbutznik movement. So it's all gone. It's as right wing there as it is here.
Well, there's
a time.
There's still a labor movement. There's still a peace movement.
Well, there's still a Democratic Party limping along here.
Right. But but controlling Israel, the Likud is firmly.
The situation's similar.
And you're right to say that part of the reason for the Iraq War was there was a geostrategic reason, getting in behind Syria so that we would be able to exert pressure on Syria to rein in Hezbollah. So Likud had its reasons, legitimate reasons, entirely legitimate from an Israeli security point of view.
From their perspective, yeah.
But 130 Americans died in that war. And we, the American people, still don't know exactly why. Because our alleged president, our so-called president, has never come before us and given us an honest answer. And there was an important story coming out of ABC News on Friday, John Cochran, talking about this. Well, what were the real reasons for the war, which were more to the geostrategic questions involving Israeli security. And the ability for the U.S. to shape events in the Middle East. But that's not anything that Bush ever said on TV. It's not something that Colin Powell ever presented to the United Nations.
It's very hard to have anything on television that's going to be critical of Israel because that's an absolute ally of the United States, isn't part of this thing.
No, but this doesn't have to be critical. I'm just saying that the Americans who went and fought and died deserve an honest answer from their government as to why they fought there. And we've been through any number of reasons, and they don't hold up. None of them hold up.
Yeah. I wonder, do you think, Vietnam was terrible. Remember Vietnam, where 27,000 Americans were killed there in a long thing. And then I think some statistics, 2 to 4 million Asians were killed by what Mr. McNamara said was mistake.
Yes.
We made a mistake.
Yes.
There's a lot of karma to be answered for there. The thing is now, I wonder, some people say he's so overreaching the top, Mr. Bush, in this case now, with this attack in Iraq and then, let's say, threatening others and maybe moving into all the stands. They got troops all over the world and this kind of thing. He's so going over the top. And there's some people who say that the real story may be, on a world global scale, you've got a world that's run by plutocrats in all countries all over the world. There's a few people who own all the assets, and that's the way it's been. Who would have thought that the people will ever have anything to say about anything? We'll gain some here in the United States through long, hard struggle, Democrats and that sort of thing. But that the real story isn't the invasion and the quasi-fascistic trending in that direction control of the neocons of this country and the world. The real reaction is that you had such a reaction by the people of the world. In Indonesia, 99.9% of the people. In Turkey, at 95%. In India, well, you were familiar with all of the, before the launching of the war, which was done in the face of all of that, even influencing their governments, which tend to be associated with plutocratic classes everywhere in the world and so forth. But the real story might be a rising, is this too idealistic, a rising or too liberal, a rising of the people against the overreaching power of the rich and powerful, as it were, as a metaphor for the world, that there may be a rising of the people who are not being served by International Monetary Fund and the kind of developments that have been going on. Joe Stiglitz and so forth will tell us is benefiting the top 20%, 60, 80% of the people aren't being served. Argentina's in the ash heap. Colombia's in trouble. But there may be a big people uprising all around the world that might be the real story, or is that reaching too far beyond the immediate headlines, do you think?
I think the headline stories during the war were the protests around the world, and these were unprecedented in size.
Yeah, and quick.
And
it took 5 years in Vietnam. This popped up all over the world. The internet must have helped.
In fact, before the war even started, it took years after the Vietnam War before people started mobilizing. Here we had people mobilizing before the war. And yes, the internet was a crucial element to it, because what it allows people to do is coordinate. At the most simple level, it allows us to say, okay, we're all going to gather at this place at this time and put it up there, and then people can spread the word.
And it was global.
And it happened all over the world.
So it's going, it's touching into the masses around the world is what I'm getting at, who have been getting a bad shake in this country. They're getting a bad shake in countries around the world, and they may be beginning to get the message that there can be a liberal response to the plutocrats who are running things, is what I'm saying, on a large global scale.
Where democracy is allowed to exist.
Democracy, real democracy.
You know, because there are a lot of places where it's not. I mean, you know, it would be great to see democracy in Egypt, for example, but it's not permitted by the powers in Egypt supported by the United States. But, you know, where you're going to see it first probably is in Western Europe, where you had the nominal labor government of Tony Blair supporting George Bush, going along with every lie and false story that they concocted together. And the Labour Party in Britain is going to have to deal with Tony Blair.
Or maybe in Spain.
In Spain with Aznar, and in Italy with Berlusconi, where there were millions.
That might be a good beginning point, yeah.
Yeah, and so we might see that the first expression of what you're talking about, which is a global resistance movement, a global democracy movement.
A global democracy movement, yeah.
Right. We may see it in these places, and it would be great to see it coalesce into a global force.
Do you think we can? We in the United States, we associate the word liberal, Mario Cuomo, that's what with the Democrats, right? The democratic movement is associated with this forbidden word liberal, that there will be a liberal resurgence around the world, possibly. There will be a reaction to the overreaching of these people who are so confident and chortling now, and they haven't even begun to realize some of the difficulties if they try to administrate in Afghanistan and all around the world. But that's what I'm saying. There might be a liberal, because it's really taken hard knocks these last couple of 3 decades in this country and around the world. That impetus is there in the human soul, as it were.
Well, a lot of the people who are involved in it will call themselves progressives, or they'll call themselves Greens. The word liberal isn't necessarily the banner under which they'll march, because because the term has been so vilified that there aren't people who really understand what it means and don't really embrace it.
Do you think maybe we should try and give a better understanding of what was meant by that, or revive it, or should we just let it die?
No, the problem is that liberal has gotten mixed up with all the kind of neoliberal economic policies represented by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that are, in fact, perceived correctly by people like Stiglitz, who work there, as a major part of the problem, not the solution, but the problem, and a major source of inequality in the world, a major source of misery in the world, poverty. So these neoliberal policies are, so the term liberal gets mixed up with the neoliberal.
All right, that's good. Well, then that might mean, because we're coming, James Joyce had Daedalus say, history is a nightmare out of which we're attempting to awaken, and we may be awakening on a world scale. We're coming, technology is coming, internet is coming, and that we may be awakening to a kind of new order, a new possibility for the masses of the people that involve everyone in a certain sense, that goes beyond the political process out of the condition out of which we're emerging. So the Democrat, Republican, the conservative, the liberal, these kind of things, it might be looking for something new that might be able to find a birth of new kind of freedom that has a forward look that the future allows, that the historical context hasn't, whether we're able to provide for greater. We have a tremendous technological capability of providing the needs of the people of this world. It's unprecedented in anything like the historical context. It may be birthing a new moment in terms of realization of something kind of new that gets beyond the traditional dialectic or something, or is that reaching too far?
Well, I think it's not necessarily been articulated in a positive term in terms of where we want to go.
We maybe should have some sort of a positive.
Yeah, I mean it's been more a reaction in negative terms to where we don't want to go.
Yeah.
I mean what the world sees is a U.S. hyperpower that is determined to control all the world's resources. And turn them over to the plutocrats. And the world doesn't like that.
Yeah.
The world wants to insist that there are certain human resources and values that belong to all the people, and that's the instinct of this global democracy movement. It also wants a real democracy where people really have a say. But it's a funny movement, and especially the peace movement, especially here in the United States. It was really a leaderless movement.
Yeah. Well, it got a sort of synergistic jump up quality. Yeah, it's got. But the Democrats are like that often. Yeah. Right.
It was democracy at its finest in that anybody could call a rally, and people would come, and all kinds of people, most diverse groups of people. It wasn't just the traditional activists. So there has been no leader of the nature of a Martin Luther King or any of the leaders of the 60s. None has emerged.
Well, it might become emerging. I mean, we could go on talking. We didn't get a chance to talk about the candidates. I know you and I both are very interested in Kucinich, and he's coming out of Ohio. There's others, a list of candidates there, and you can't hardly do better than go to Democrats.com to get a fix on what's going on as far as the Democratic possibilities. I'm sorry we run out of time. We go on talking for hours, but pleasure.
Likewise.
Your pleasure to have had the perception. Bob Fertig, and he's the involved with chairman. I don't know what you call yourself. Co-founder of Democrat.com. You can find it on the internet, a site where you can go to. And Bob, thanks a lot for coming in. We just got a chance to touch the surface of a big and important subject. We're in Conversations. Invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now. But Bob, once again, thanks very much for coming in, and all the best.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Until next week. So, that's the trouble. You run out of time, even
an hour
just goes by so fast, But your site is great. It's really great. You got some humor there. I think we have to use some humor.
It's very important.
Are you optimistic, or what do you think?
It's hard to be optimistic because they've got so much power.
They've got so much control,
and the media control is so absolute that my faith is in the internet because it allows us to bypass.
Well, there can be a combination here. We're in television a little bit, and the internet's going broadband. I think more and more. We stream this, so we're going all over the world. So there might be a combination between this access movement and some of the stuff in television and the internet, because I think the internet is the future of access television, and you got a big outreach.
Yeah,
this communication is a link between the internet and television.
My particular focus on it, and I think you've discovered this too, is that you have to make it easy for people. And surfing the web is not something people spend a lot of time doing.
Yeah.
So you got to send them an email that says, "Here's what's coming up today." And that's, since you're doing it, you understand that. People.
Well, I do that with my little tunes.
That's right.
Yeah,
but
that's the thing I'm doing.
But
I
you
just
do it
started
with your
doing
schedule of who you're interviewing.
Oh, that I got to let people know around the world that they can see it. But when it's
Right.
on the internet, that's the start of something. That's a place to get some communication.